The first time I saw the hospital basement, I had the overwhelming urge to run. Not just leave, run, sprint. Flee like something inside me understood, before my brain could, that I didn't belong down there. The air was wrong. It was thick and stagnant, like the place hadn't breathed in decades. The dim, flickering lights buzzed in a way that itched in my skull, a frequency just low enough to make my teeth hurt. And the silence wasn't silence. It was layered, the kind of quiet that suggested something else was lurking just beneath it, something waiting for me to listen closely enough. I had been desperate for a job. Too desperate. I hadn't questioned why a hospital was offering triple the normal pay for a simple night shift in the basement. I didn't hesitate when they told me there were some rules I'd need to follow. But standing there, looking down that endless gray corridor, I felt it deep in my gut. I had made a mistake. The hiring process should have tipped me off. The manager, a gaunt man named Mr. Langley, barely looked at me during the interview. He only asked one real question. Are you easily frightened? At the time, I had scoffed. I was an ex-medic, had seen more than my share of blood, trauma, and death. I'd worked war zones, emergency rooms, even the prison system. I told him no, I wasn't easily frightened. His expression twitched. Not quite relief, not quite satisfaction. More like pity. He slid a contract across the desk, avoiding eye contact. Sign here. The shift starts at midnight. No explanation of duties. No paperwork beyond a single-page waiver that felt too vague, too convenient. I should have walked away. I didn't. Now, as I rode the elevator down, I realized something was off. The descent felt too long. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered. The buttons didn't have labels. Then, for just a second, the light went out completely. And in that split second of darkness, I swear, I wasn't alone in the elevator. A whisper brushed against my ear. You shouldn't have come. The lights snapped back on. I was alone. I didn't move for a long second, barely breathing. My own reflection in the elevator doors looked wrong. Not distorted, not monstrous, just a little too still, like it was waiting for something. Ding, the doors slid open and I stepped into the basement. The moment I crossed the threshold, a sensation crawled over my skin, a feeling of being observed. Not just by cameras, but by something older, something patient. The hallway stretched longer than it should have. I walked forward, my footsteps barely echoing. The temperature dropped. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and something metallic. At the end of the hall stood a single figure. A man. Thin, hollow-eyed. Face pale and gaunt, like he hadn't slept in years. His uniform was the same as mine, except older, more worn. He held a clipboard in one shaking hand. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't place, somewhere between exhaustion and warning. Then he held out a sheet of paper. I took it. It was a list of rules. 1. Never use the freight elevator between 3:12 a.m. 3:16 a.m. If it opens on its own, do not step inside. 2. If you hear a patient crying past 2 a.m., do not approach. That room has been empty for years. 3. If the hallway seems longer than usual, walk back immediately. You are not where you think you are. 4. Never respond if someone calls your name from the supply closet, and at the bottom scrawled hastily in pen. 5. Do not talk to me. I was never here. My blood ran cold. I looked up. The man was gone, and the hallway had changed. It was longer now. Much longer. Something breathed in the dark ahead, and then, just beyond the last flickering light, a second figure stepped into view. It was me, smiling. I froze, staring at the figure at the end of the hallway. It was me. But it wasn't me. The version of me at the end of the hall was standing a little too still, head cocked at an unnatural angle. The expression on its face, it wasn't mine. It was twisted into something that resembled a smile, but a smile that felt wrong. The hair on my neck stood up as I took a step back, my pulse spiking. My thoughts were racing. What the hell was going on? For a long moment, I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, as if on cue, the thing that was me took a step forward. Each movement it made felt too calculated, too precise, like it was watching me, mimicking me, waiting for me to react. I swallowed hard, forcing my feet to stay planted to the floor. A voice screamed in my head to turn around, to run the hell back to the elevator and get out. But something deeper, forced me to stay. It took another step. My breath hitched. The air felt thick again, like it was pressing in from all sides. The hallway was warping. No, stretching. The walls seemed to be moving, pulling in on me, and the ceiling seemed to lower with every passing second. The distant figure of the false me took another step forward, and it was almost within arm's reach now. "Stop," I managed to whisper. The word barely escaped my throat. The version of me tilted its head, the smile widening. It didn't speak. It didn't have to. I stumbled backward, my hand reaching behind me, feeling for something to steady myself against. I gripped the walls, but they were cold, wet, like flesh. The lights flickered. In the dark, I saw it again. A brief glimpse. More figures. Dozens of them, standing just out of the reach of the dim light, watching. Silent, still, waiting. Their eyes, no, their gazes, locked onto me, suffocating me with their intensity. I could feel their presence in the air, thick and suffocating, as if they were watching and waiting for something to happen. The elevator. I spun, desperately looking for it, but there was no elevator anymore. No escape, just the hallway, stretching farther and farther, the walls closing in. And then I heard it. A voice, soft, almost like a whisper, calling my name. It was unmistakable. My voice. "Come to me." I turned, heart racing, desperately searching for the source. But there was nothing, just the sickening sound of my own voice echoing off the walls. The hallway was growing longer still. The lights above flickered again, and with each flicker, the figures seemed to get closer. It felt like the walls were breathing, like the entire basement was alive. I glanced at the sheet of rules in my hand, but now they didn't make any sense at all. The ink seemed to be shifting on the page, the words morphing, blurring together like they were alive. I couldn't make out what they said anymore. They were just screaming at me, screaming something I didn't understand. I crumpled the paper in my hand and tossed it aside. The air stank now, a rancid, sour odor I couldn't identify. My skin crawled, the lights went out again. In the darkness, I heard something moving, slowly. The elevator doors slid open behind me, and I knew I shouldn't step inside, but every instinct I had told me to get in. You'll want to follow the rules. That voice again, soft and smooth, a woman's voice this time. It sounded so familiar. Miss Harris, the day supervisor, had warned me to keep the rules in mind. But the thing was, the rules didn't apply anymore. "Get in the elevator," the voice whispered again. "Hurry." My heart pounded in my chest as I took a hesitant step toward the open elevator doors. My body screamed at me to leave, to turn around and flee, but I felt myself compelled. I was already moving toward it before I could stop myself. But then, as I got closer, something caught my eye. Something on the floor just in front of the elevator. It was a small white scalpel, and it was dripping with fresh blood. My blood. I froze, staring at it. My pulse raced as I realized what it meant. It was me. I was being pulled into something that wasn't real, wasn't human. The blood, my blood, was a sign, a warning. I felt my throat tighten, my chest constricting. I turned instinctively and bolted down the hall, the shadows behind me thickening, closing in. But I heard something behind me, footsteps, scraping against the floor, heavy breathing. I didn't dare look back. I ran. I ran like my life depended on it because deep down I knew it did. I didn't stop running until I reached the elevator, breathless and trembling. I slammed the button with shaking fingers, praying it would come down fast enough. The seconds dragged on in a blur of panic, the oppressive silence of the hallway closing in like a suffocating cloud. When the doors finally slid open, I stepped in without thinking. My hands were slick with sweat as I pressed the button for the first floor, the light flickering above my head as the elevator descended slowly. I didn't know what to make of what I had just experienced. The figures, the voice, the sensation that the very walls of the basement were alive, pulsating with some dark energy. My heart was still racing in my chest, and the elevator felt too small, too claustrophobic. My skin was crawling, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight, watching me. The doors opened to the first floor with a soft chime, and I stepped out into the quiet, sterile hospital lobby. It was still eerily empty, despite the hum of machines and the occasional shuffle of someone in the distance. I glanced around, but no one seemed to be in sight. I paused at the security desk, my mind racing as I tried to gather myself. It was just a job. That's what I kept telling myself. A paycheck, bills to pay, nothing more. But that didn't explain the sense of unease that had settled over me. Nothing felt normal here. When I turned to head down the hallway toward the break room, I noticed something odd. The temperature had dropped. It wasn't just cold, it was freezing. The chill sliced through my uniform, sending a shiver down my spine. I pulled my sleeves down tighter around my arms, trying to ignore the sudden goosebumps that crawled over my skin. The hallway in front of me seemed darker than it should have been, the lights overhead flickering sporadically. I stopped for a second, letting the unease wash over me. That's when I noticed the wheelchair. It was at the far end of the hallway, a patient's chair sitting innocently against the wall, right where it shouldn't have been. It was empty. Yet, it wasn't stationary. The chair was slightly rolling, inch by inch, as though someone had just pushed it and forgotten to lock the wheels. I stepped closer, my breath caught in my throat, but when I reached for it, the wheelchair stopped moving, as if it had been waiting for me to notice. I stood there, staring at it, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up straight. I didn't know why, but I felt compelled to leave it alone. That was the first rule, wasn't it? Don't touch anything that doesn't belong. Don't interact with the strange occurrences. I took a step back, my eyes never leaving the wheelchair. I could feel something watching me just beyond my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. I swallowed hard and turned away, deciding to get back to work, my heart still thudding in my chest. But as I walked past the nurse's station, something caught my eye. A gown. It was neatly folded outside one of the locked rooms, just beside the door. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat as I looked at it. The gown was hospital issue, but its neatness was strange. Too neat. No one would leave something like that in such a precise, careful manner. My mind raced, remembering the rules. One of them specifically said, never move anything that's left outside a locked room. It seemed ridiculous, but I had seen the consequences of disregarding the rules. I had no intention of finding out what would happen if I ignored this one. Still, something about that gown bothered me. I left it alone, following the rules, but as I continued on my rounds, the nagging feeling that I had missed something started to gnaw at me. I didn't want to return to the basement, but I had no choice. That's where I was needed, checking the security monitors, making sure everything was operating as it should be. I headed back to the security office, the weight of the gown still heavy in my mind. I glanced at the screens as I sat down, flipping through different angles of the hospital. The usual patients in the rooms, the staff moving through the hallways, nothing out of the ordinary. But then, the screen in front of me flickered. I stared at it, squinting. At first, I thought it was just a glitch. The footage seemed distorted, the figures moving in jerky, unnatural ways. But then, one of the figures stopped. It was wearing the same gown I had seen outside the room. It was on one of the floors, its back to the camera, but the details were clear enough. The figure was standing perfectly still, unnaturally still, like it was waiting. And then I saw it. The face, there was none. Just a blank space where the face should have been. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth skin, almost like it had been erased. My stomach turned over as I looked at the monitor, unable to look away. It was wearing the same gown, the same neatness, the same cleanliness. But it wasn't right. I didn't know what to do. I felt frozen in place, my mind racing. Was this the same person? Had someone sneaked into that room? But I knew, deep down, that wasn't the case. It was something else, something wrong. I quickly switched the monitor off, feeling the blood rush from my face. My hands were shaking, my mind spiraling. What had I just seen? And that was when I heard it. The intercom crackled to life, the static a harsh screech in the quiet security room. My heart skipped a beat as I leaned toward the speaker, hearing something. A voice, distorted but unmistakable. Get out! It wasn't the voice of anyone I recognized. It was garbled, as if the words were being forced out, strained. Get out! It was repeated, louder this time, and my heart slammed against my ribs. I glanced at the clock, 2:33 a.m., the exact time the janitor had warned me about. I stood frozen in place, my entire body tense. What should I do? Should I run? Should I listen? The static stopped as abruptly as it had started, and the silence was suffocating. The air was thick and oppressive, the chill that had settled in my bones turning into something worse, something malignant. I didn't know how much longer I could take this. Every moment felt like a countdown to something terrible. The lights flickered, and I saw it. Something standing at the far end of the hallway. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and it stood perfectly still. Too still. Its body was a dark silhouette, but I couldn't see any features, just a shape. And in the moment when the lights flickered back to full brightness, it was gone. Gone like it had never been there at all. But I knew it hadn't been a trick of the light. I had seen it. I knew what I had seen. And the fear, the cold dread that settled deep in my gut, told me I was not alone in this building. I should have left. I should have turned around, grabbed my things, and walked out. But I didn't. Instead, I kept walking through the quiet hallways, forcing myself to ignore the ever-growing sense that something was wrong, something I couldn't name. Every creak of the floorboards seemed louder now. The air felt heavier, thicker. It was as if the building itself was watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. And then the elevator called to me. I didn't want to go near it. I knew I should stay away. But it was the freight elevator, the one the rules specifically warned against. And despite everything, despite my gut telling me to run, I couldn't resist the pull. I needed to know. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the fear that was gnawing at me, making my thoughts scatter. But whatever it was, I found myself pressing the button for the freight elevator. The doors slid open and I stepped inside, my heart hammering against my chest. I hesitated for a moment, glancing at the clock. It was just past 3:12 a.m. The second I stepped inside, the doors shut with a hollow thud. The elevator began its descent, slower than I remembered, as if it were dragging me deeper into the building. A cold wave of air pressed in, and the lights above flickered. The soft hum of the motor seemed to pulse, a low, eerie sound that reverberated in the small, cramped space. As the floors ticked by, I kept glancing up, waiting for the familiar ding that would signal the next stop. But it didn't stop. The elevator continued to descend, and I realized with a sinking feeling that it had passed every listed level. It wasn't supposed to go this far down. I pressed the buttons frantically, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Nothing happened. The descent continued. I couldn't even hear the floors above me anymore. It was as if the elevator was traveling through an abyss. The doors finally jolted to a stop with a sound that made my teeth ache. They slid open with a deep groan, and I stepped out cautiously, trying to steady my breath. The air was colder here, damp and stale, like it had been sealed off for years. My shoes echoed on the concrete floor, each step bouncing off the walls as I looked around. What I saw nearly made my heart stop. The hallway stretched out before me, far longer than it should have been. The walls were old, covered in peeling paint and grime. Rusted hospital beds lined the corridor, the metal frames twisted and bent in odd angles, as if they had been abandoned in haste. Each bed was covered with a sheet, but there was something wrong about the way the fabric lay, as though the shape beneath it wasn't quite right. I took a step forward, then another, drawn by an inexplicable need to see more. My fingers were trembling as I reached out to touch one of the beds. The sheet was thick with dust, and as I pulled it back slightly, I gasped. There was nothing underneath it. Nothing at all. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, when I heard it. A slow, deliberate sound of something moving. I turned, heart lurching in my chest, and that's when I saw it. A figure at the far end of the hallway, standing perfectly still. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the dim lighting, a shadow or a trick of my exhausted eyes. But no. This figure was real, and then it moved. Its head turned sharply toward me, too quickly, too unnaturally. The sound of bones cracking, snapping into place, reverberated down the hallway. It was like something out of a nightmare, a thing that shouldn't move like that, a grotesque, twisted figure whose neck bent at an impossible angle. I froze, rooted to the spot, unable to breathe, unable to move. The figure took a slow step toward me, its head cocked to one side like it was studying me, analyzing my every move. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears, my vision narrowing. I should run. I should scream. But the terror held me in place, a vice around my chest. Every instinct told me to run, to flee, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. It was getting closer. And then, just as I thought I might collapse, the alarm blared. The shrill sound cut through the air and my body snapped back to reality. My legs moved before my brain could process the motion. I turned, running back toward the elevator, not caring whether I was running toward safety or deeper into whatever hell had opened up beneath the hospital. I reached the elevator doors and pounded on the button, my hands slick with sweat. The doors finally opened, and I didn't hesitate. I stepped inside, pressing the button for the first floor as fast as my fingers would allow. The elevator jerked into motion, rising back up, the loud whir of the motor drowning out the frantic beating of my heart. I collapsed against the back of the elevator, gasping for air. What the hell had I just seen? The doors opened to the first floor with a jolt, and I stepped out, unsteady, my legs shaking. The sterile brightness of the hospital lobby felt like a haven, a place of safety compared to the horrors I had just encountered. But I couldn't shake the image of that figure, its head twisted too far around, its eyes, or what should have been eyes, locked onto me as I ran. I staggered toward the security desk, still trying to steady my breath. But as I passed the nurse's station, I was stopped by a voice. "You took the elevator, didn't you?" It was the night supervisor, an older man with a sharp gaze. His eyes were narrowed, his face set in a stern expression. "Didn't you?" he repeated, his voice quieter now. "If it calls for you again, don't get inside." My stomach twisted. I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. I nodded instead, too shaken to speak. "I didn't want to believe it at first either," he said, his voice softening, almost a whisper. "But you've seen it now, haven't you? You've seen what happens when you break the rules." I felt the cold weight of his words settle around me, like a shroud. And in that moment, I knew that I hadn't just stumbled onto something strange. I had stepped into something far worse. I couldn't shake the lingering image of that figure, the twisted thing that had watched me from the end of the hallway. That unnatural movement, the way its head had turned, it was still burned into my mind. The fear was growing, suffocating me. But I couldn't stop myself from needing to know more. I had to understand what was happening in this place. The rules weren't just random quirks of a paranoid staff. They were the only thing keeping whatever was down there at bay. Whatever that thing was, whatever it had been, it was tied to the hospital. And the elevator wasn't the only way it could reach out to you. I had already broken one of the rules, and now I felt like I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't control, something that would drag me in deeper if I wasn't careful. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the building made me jump. Every shift of the air felt like a prelude to something worse. I knew I couldn't let it go. I couldn't just ignore what I'd seen. So I began to investigate. The first step was to find out more about the basement, about the hospital's past. I spent hours digging through old files in the archives, pushing through dusty folders and yellowing papers. It was strange how the building felt more oppressive the deeper I went, as though the walls themselves were closing in, blocking me from the truth. And then I found it. There were records, old, hidden away in a back corner of the basement storage. The pages were brittle, faded with age, but I could still make out the words, the ones that chilled me to the bone. Uncontained subject number 13. The words blurred before my eyes as I read them over and over again. There were other documents too, just as disturbing. Mentions of anomalous patient transfer, behavioral testing failure, and containment breach. The deeper I read, the more I realized how much had been swept under the rug. The files mentioned something, someone, locked away deep within the building. A subject who, for reasons that were never fully explained, was contained in the hospital's sublevels. But there were gaps in the records, missing pages. It was as if someone didn't want me to know the full story. Someone was trying to erase it. As I read on, I started to hear voices, soft murmurs like whispers from behind the walls. I couldn't tell if it was my mind playing tricks on me or something else. But the sense of being watched, of being hunted, was growing stronger. I had to know more. I went to the one person who might know, an old security guard who had worked at the hospital for years before retiring. He'd always been there, standing watch over the building, the only other person I had seen in the lower levels outside of the staff. He was a tall, thin man with sunken eyes, as though he hadn't slept in years. He eyed me warily when I asked about the hospital's past. At first, he wouldn't say a word, but I pushed, asking the right questions, questions that hinted at the strange things I'd already witnessed. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and gravelly, barely a whisper. "This place wasn't always a hospital," he said, his eyes flickering nervously to the shadows around us. "Before it was a hospital, it was a research facility. A damn secret one. They were doing things here, things no one should have been doing. Not just medical experiments, but Other things. Some of the patients, they never left. They were taken down into the basement, locked away. His voice grew fainter, as though he feared being heard. The higher-ups never liked to talk about it, but the things they kept down there, in the depths, those things, they're still here, still waiting. I froze, the full weight of his words hitting me like a punch to the gut. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't just a haunted hospital. It was a holding place, a prison. And whatever was in the basement was contained for a reason. I didn't need him to elaborate further. The pieces were falling into place. I had broken a rule. I had walked into the depths of the hospital, into the place where whatever was being contained was kept. And now it was awake. The rules weren't there to protect us from ghosts. They were there to contain something far worse. Something alive. The realization hit me with full force, and my stomach churned. The rules weren't about keeping the dead away. They were about keeping the living, the thing in the basement, from getting out. And when I stepped into that freight elevator, I had done more than just break a rule. I had drawn its attention. I had walked right into its territory. The old security guard's warning echoed in my head as I made my way back to the basement, heart pounding. If it calls for you again, don't get inside. But what if it already had? What if I was already too far gone? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was drawing me in. The sensation gnawed at me, a presence that seemed to be just on the edge of my perception, waiting for me to make the next move. The rules, they weren't just there to protect me. They were there to contain something that was far worse than anything I could ever imagine. That night, as I worked, I couldn't focus. The hospital seemed different now, heavier somehow, as though the very air was thick with some unseen force. The lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the sterile walls. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often, as if expecting someone or something to be standing just out of sight. Then, without warning, the power went out. The emergency lights flickered on, casting the basement in an eerie, dim glow. It was enough to light the halls, but not enough to chase away the shadows that seemed to stretch and grow with every passing second. A cold, unnatural silence settled over the place, broken only by the faint hum of the emergency lights and the occasional click of an old vent system. But there was something else. Something far worse. The security feeds went black, one by one. Every monitor, every camera, every system that had been in place to keep watch over the building, it was gone. Except for one. One single screen remained on, showing a sterile, white room with harsh fluorescent lights buzzing above. I stared at the screen in confusion. It was an operating room, but it wasn't one that should have been there. The walls looked too new, the instruments gleaming as if they had just been used. But that wasn't what froze me in place. It was the voice. A soft, pleading voice crackled through the intercom. Please help me. Someone, please. I couldn't breathe. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure of what to do. I should have ignored it. I should have turned off the screen, called for help, anything to get away from it. But I couldn't. Something inside me compelled me to investigate, to find the source of the voice. As I dug through the records, I found something that made my stomach drop. That operating room had been sealed decades ago. The room wasn't supposed to exist. It shouldn't have been there, shouldn't have been on any of the security feeds. And yet, there it was, clear as day, calling to me. I grabbed my flashlight and raced down the hallway toward the location shown on the screen. My footsteps echoed loudly in the silence, the only sound that broke through the stillness. The deeper I went, the more the walls seemed to stretch, as though they were growing taller and longer with every step I took. The hallway never seemed to end, no matter how fast I walked, no matter how many turns I made. When I reached the door, I could feel my heart in my throat. The door? It wasn't supposed to be here. There was nothing in the records about a door in this part of the basement. It was an anomaly, a strange, impossible thing that I couldn't explain. But it was right there in front of me, a plain wooden door that looked too old, too out of place. I pushed it open. What I saw inside made my stomach lurch. A figure was strapped to an old operating table in the center of the room. Its skin was pale, stretched thin over its bones, its body unnaturally still. I couldn't even tell if it was human or something else entirely. But as I stepped closer, its eyes snapped open. wide, hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly into my soul. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't move, couldn't tear my gaze away from the figure. Its eyes didn't blink, didn't waver, just watched me as if it knew exactly what I was thinking. Then the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, panic surging through my veins. The door was locked. I couldn't get out. I was trapped. The footsteps started then. At first, they were soft, almost imperceptible, but as the seconds stretched into minutes, they grew louder, closer. Someone, or something, was coming for me. I could hear it in the hall, feel the ground tremble with each step. I turned, frantic now, and reached for the door, banging my fists against it. But it wouldn't budge. The footsteps were almost on top of me now. I could feel the air shift, the temperature drop. The room seemed to close in around me, its walls growing taller, suffocating me. And then I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from just behind me. I spun around, my flashlight shaking in my hand, but there was nothing there, no one, no thing, just the stillness of the operating room. The growl came again, this time from directly above me. I didn't wait to see what it was. With every ounce of strength I had left, I pushed open the door and bolted out into the hall, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't dare look back. The footsteps were still there, echoing behind me, growing louder with every step I took. The shadow of something or someone was closing in. I didn't care where I was going. I didn't care if I was running in the wrong direction. I just needed to get away from that room, from that thing. But as I stumbled down the hallway, my heart sinking into my chest, I realized something. I wasn't alone. Whatever it was following me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But I could feel it. The air had shifted again, heavier, colder. I could hear the faint, almost imperceptible sound of movement, slow, deliberate. It was just behind me, too close for comfort. Every step I took, every turn I made, the presence stayed with me, a dark shadow pressing against my every breath. I didn't dare turn around. I was terrified to see what might be there, what might have followed me from that operating room. But something inside me snapped. I couldn't keep running without answers. I couldn't keep pretending everything would be okay if I just followed the rules. I had to know the truth. So I went to the one person who might have some answers, the senior staff member I had spoken to earlier. The one who had warned me about the elevator. The one whose cryptic words had haunted me since my first night. I found him in the break room, hunched over a coffee cup, his tired eyes flicking up to meet mine as I stepped through the door. He didn't say anything at first. I could tell he knew why I was here. He had that look in his eyes, the one that said he had been waiting for this moment. "I know something's wrong down here," I said, my voice tight with frustration, my throat dry. "What's really going on in this place?" He took a long breath, letting the silence stretch between us. For a moment, I thought he might refuse to answer, that he would brush me off again like all the others. But then he sighed, lowering his coffee cup. His hands shook slightly, and I realized how much he had been dreading this conversation. "The basement wasn't just for storage," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "They were conducting experiments, and they failed to contain what they made." My heart stopped. I felt like the ground had slipped away beneath my feet. "What? What do you mean?" He leaned in closer, his eyes darting around as if checking to see if anyone else was listening. His voice dropped to almost a hiss. "They weren't trying to cure disease or save lives down there. No, they were playing with something else. Something ancient. It was never meant to be here, but they brought it here anyway." I could feel the blood drain from my face. My stomach turned. "The rules," he continued, his eyes darkening, "they're not superstition. They're a contract, a bargain. As long as we follow them, it stays in its place." I could hardly breathe. What happened to the people who didn't follow the rules? I managed to ask, though my voice barely rose above a whisper. "They're either gone or they're part of it now. It doesn't let go easily, and once you break a rule, you're marked. You can't escape it. The contract is broken." I felt the weight of his words settle like a lead weight in my chest. It was true. I had broken a rule. I had used the freight elevator, and that's when everything had started to fall apart. The thing, the presence that had followed me, that had been haunting me since that first night, it wasn't going to stop now. I was marked. I stood there for a long moment, my mind spinning, trying to process everything he had just told me. The dread that had built up inside me since that first night seemed to surge, swallowing me whole. "But the rules," I began, trying to grasp at some hope. "Why didn't they stop it? Why hasn't it stopped?" He shook his head slowly. "Because the contract was never meant to be permanent. It's just a temporary measure, a containment protocol. But now that you've broken it, there's nothing to keep it down." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The implications of his words were clear. The thing that had been stalking me, the thing that had been growing stronger with every rule I had broken, was about to break free. It wasn't just a part of the hospital anymore. It was everywhere, and I couldn't stop it. That night, as I returned to the basement, the familiar chill in the air felt different, colder, darker. The shadows seemed deeper, stretching out across the walls like hands reaching for me. I knew I was running out of time. Every second that passed, the thing that had been contained for so long was getting closer to breaking free. I stepped into the elevator, my heart racing in my chest. The doors closed behind me with an unnatural heaviness, as if the entire building was holding its breath. I could feel the weight of what was coming, and I knew there was no going back. The rules had been my only shield, and now that shield had crumbled. As the elevator descended deeper into the bowels of the hospital, I felt my stomach twist. The familiar hum of the machinery around me seemed to distort, turning into a low, guttural sound that vibrated through my bones. The walls of the elevator seemed to warp, stretching in unnatural ways, and for a moment I thought I saw something shifting in the corner of my eye. I didn't look. I couldn't. I knew it was too late. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped into the basement. It was different now, darker, more oppressive. The walls seemed to close in around me as if the hospital itself was trying to swallow me whole. And then I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold, a low, whispering voice. "Come to me." I froze, the last rule, the final rule. Never let it call your name, never respond. But I had already broken it, and now there was no escape. The voice that had been whispering to me before seemed to grow louder, more insistent. It was no longer a soft murmur in the darkness. It was almost a chant, repeating my name over and over again until I could hear it in my head, like it was vibrating through my skull. My legs felt like they were made of stone, unwilling to move, but my mind screamed at me to run, to get away, to break free from whatever was pulling me in. But I couldn't. Not anymore. I stepped forward, my body moving almost against my will, guided by that voice. The shadows around me twisted, shifting in ways that defied logic. But I couldn't stop myself. I was beyond reason now. The thing had been waiting, watching me, waiting for the moment when I would break. I was too far gone. I reached the door at the end of the hall, the one that shouldn't have been there, the one I had walked past so many times. It opened without me touching it, its hinges creaking in protest. And I saw it. The thing I had feared. It was no longer hiding in the shadows. It was right in front of me, its grotesque form standing in the room, watching me with empty, hollow eyes. It didn't speak, but I could hear its voice in my head. "Come to me," it whispered, and my body moved toward it, almost on its own. And then, just as I reached the threshold, the world went black. I woke up in my own bed, drenched in sweat, my heart hammering in my chest. The first thing I noticed was the silence, an oppressive, all-encompassing silence. I glanced around the room, unsure for a moment whether I had just dreamed everything. But no, I could still feel the weight of the fear in my bones, the lingering dread from the basement. I had left the hospital. I had quit. I had packed my things and walked out, never looking back. Or so I thought. But that night, as I lay in bed trying to shake off the remnants of the nightmare that still clung to me, I heard it again. The whisper. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but there was no mistaking it. My name, over and over, calling me. I sat up, my heart racing. It wasn't in the room with me, but it was everywhere, inside my head. A part of me wanted to get up and run, to tear the walls apart if I had to, but I couldn't. I had left. I had escaped. But it never left me.